Now for today's program. Lynne Olson is a New York Times bestselling author, mainly with a focus on World War II. Her latest book is The Sisterhood of Ravensbrück: How an Intrepid Band of French Women Resisted the Nazis in Hitler's all-female concentration camp. Lynne has been a consulting historian for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Before becoming a full-time author, Lynne was a journalist for the Associated Press and the Baltimore Sun, and worked as a national feature writer, foreign correspondent in Moscow, and political reporter in Washington, D.C. Amy E. Schwartz is Moment Magazine's opinion and books editor, as well as editor of the magazine's popular Ask the Rabbi section, and she's won first place in commentary from the Religion News Association. Before coming to Moment, Amy was a longtime editorial writer and op-ed columnist at the Washington Post, where she was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in commentary. Amy is president of the Non-Denominational Jewish Study Center in Washington, D.C., and is editor of the book Can Robots Be Jewish? And Other Pressing Questions of Modern Life. Please welcome Lynne Olson and Amy E. Schwartz.
Thanks so much for coming, and thanks to everyone for signing on this beautiful summer day to this kind of dark story, although ultimately in some ways uplifting. So, Lynn, I'm so happy to get to talk to you about this fascinating book. It's an amazing story in itself, but it's also part of something bigger, and I wanted to actually start with that. You've written 10 books. This is your 10th book, many of them about unsung women heroes, heroines, and this is part of that story. Can you talk about, first of all, how you happened to get interested in telling these kinds of stories and what led you to this one in particular? And then after that, I wonder if you would talk about whether this is part of a wider pattern of rediscovering these kinds of stories.
First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure. That is a big question. I was a journalist, as Suzanne said, and I got interested in writing books. And the first book that I wrote with my husband was called The Murrow Boys, which was about Edward R. Murrow and the correspondents he hired to create CBS News, much of which took place during World War II. After writing that book, one book led to another, and I found myself attracted to stories about people who had contributed a lot to their country and the world during the war, but had kind of fallen into the cracks of history for various reasons. And so I actually was not conscious I was doing it. But about the third book, I realized, oh my God, these are people that nobody's ever heard of. And I'm introducing them. And so it didn't start out as a conscious decision on my part, but it basically did become a decision. I got a contract from Random House, my publisher, to do a book about something totally different. And it was about men. And I couldn't stand the men I was writing about. And I thought, this is not my wheelhouse. I mean, I had to go back to what I was comfortable with, was finding people who had really made a difference, and introduce them to the world.
And that's almost definitionally going to be women, right?
Well, actually, in the beginning it wasn't. I mean, I started writing about World War II, and because obviously wars are really very male oriented, many of them were not. I mean, I wrote a book called Citizens of London, and the main hero in it was John Gilbert Wynant, who was the American ambassador to England during the war. Nobody has ever heard of him before, but so he was the hero. He was the unsung hero in that book. So for the first 7 books of the 10, I focused mostly on men. I mean, on whatever I was writing about. I tried to introduce women as much as I could, but mostly about men. And then all of a sudden, after the 7th book, which is very much, my books were up to that point very much oriented to the UK, Great Britain, and the US during World War II. I became fascinated by France, and I switched my attention to France and to women in France. I've written 3 books about women in France. The first one was about the only woman to run a major resistance organization in France, the only woman. And I had never heard of her, and nobody else had ever heard of her because basically she had been forgotten. And so I was just fascinated with her and the role of women in the resistance in France. And that fascination continued to, over the next two books. So that's really how I ended up writing this particular book.
And it happened organically for you, but I have noticed that there's been recently, it seems like there's a big movement to reclaim the women's the stories of female resistors,
Yes.
female undercover agents, different kinds of female bravery. Is that
No,
that
that's absolutely true. It's true across the board. It's not just the war and the resistance. I mean, we've noticed, in the last 10, 15 years, stories about the women in NASA, women code breakers,
figures? Yeah.
you know, there've just been a huge number. And these women were there all along, but I think, the people who are writing these books are mainly women. And it's just been this kind of explosion of interest in women who had made a difference. But it's especially true, I think, when you look at France and the resistance. I mean, for decades after the end of the war, basically men took over the story. Women were really the lifeblood of the resistance. The French resistance could not have operated without women. They were in it every bit as much as men. There weren't as many, but there were a lot. And basically the men at the end of the war and after the war just said, no, women weren't part of it. We did it all. And that attitude continued because then the history books started coming out, and most of the early histories of the French resistance were, of course, written by men, almost all of them, and they continued that story that women played a peripheral role. They were in the background, but they weren't important. And so that really continued until I'd say maybe 10, 15 years ago. And then again, all of a sudden, there has been an explosion of books about women in the French resistance, and I wrote one early one. But one of the reasons I wrote this particular book is that that it's all wonderful that these women are being rediscovered. But no attention was really paid to, I mean, most of the attention in those books, including mine, were about what those women had done during the war, their achievements, what they had been able to accomplish, the danger they were in, etc. But very few, or almost none, really looked at the women, the tens of thousands of women who were captured by the Gestapo and sent to concentration camps or to prisons. And certainly there was almost nothing about the fact that many of these women, having been, raised in become very, very good at resisting, once they got to, in this case, the camp of Ravensbruck, they continued to resist the Germans in the camp. And I just thought that, I mean, that's a really, really good story that I did not know, and I had overlooked. And so that was really the impetus for me to write this book.
So tell us about this particular story and what's so remarkable about it. I mean, what was so unusual about Ravensbrück, and why, why was it overlooked? I mean,
Ravensbrück, what's so interesting, since the book has come out, and that's only been a few weeks, I've learned, I am so steeped in World War II. I think that everybody knows what I know, and that's not true, obviously. But I thought that most people would know. I knew that Ravensbrück existed. I knew that there had been an all-female camp called Ravensbrück, and that it was horrific and all that. But I'm finding that most people I talked to had never heard of it before.
Didn't know there was an all-women's camp at all.
Yeah, they didn't know, or yes, exactly. They didn't know that there was all-women's camp, or really anything about it. They had never even heard of it. They had never heard the name Ravensbrück. And there's a number of really good reasons for that. First of all, unlike camps like Buchenwald and Dachau we're familiar with now, when they were liberated early in 1945, it was American troops who liberated them for the most part. And so those American troops had American journalists like Edward R. Murrow covering them. And so they were there, the journalists were there during the liberation, and they saw, along with the troops, the horrors of the concentration camps that really nobody, or very few people in the United States or England or any place else knew about. And so those journalists, those photographers, those cameramen, they were the ones that took the photos, and they provided the footage of what most of us have seen, in school, the photos and the footage of piles of dead bodies and, the skeleton-like survivors. But Ravensbrück was liberated by the Soviet troops much later. And there were no journalists, or at least no Western journalists, covering that. So there was no attention paid to the liberation of Ravensbrück. It occurred, as I said, it occurred late in the game, months after the other camps had been liberated. And by that time, basically the war was done, and people were looking toward, the future and it being over. So the camp itself and the women that were in the camp were basically ignored. And that continued because Ravensbrück was in the Soviet zone in post-war Germany. And so no Westerners were allowed anywhere near it. It became a Soviet military base. So, basically it was forgotten. It was written out of history.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back and tell us about some of these amazing women who are the characters in your story.
Yeah, I mean, I focus on, first of all, Ravensbrück was, the inmates there were mostly women who had been in resistance movements all over Europe, occupied Europe. It wasn't just France. It was Germany. It was Poland. It was Czechoslovakia, Holland. Every country, every occupied country had resistance movements, and there were a lot of women in all of them. So the women came from these various countries. I focus on the French because they were particularly active and organized in fighting back at Ravensbrück. But other women from all over Europe were doing the same thing. And I focus on 4 women in particular. I found that, if you write about just a few people in the forefront. I mean, of course, there are lots of characters in this book, but that I think a reader really kind of identifies, with those women more so than if you just devote a couple of sentences to them. So yes, there are 4 young women. They were all fairly young. The oldest was Germaine Tillion, who is really the central character in the book. She was a young anthropologist who spent years in the mountains of Algeria studying Berber tribes. She was France's version of Margaret Mead. So she was the oldest. She was in her 30s. The second one was Geneviève de Gaulle, who was the niece of Charles de Gaulle, General Charles de Gaulle. She was in her early 20s, as were the other 2 that I focus on. Anice Girard and Jacqueline Dallencourt. So what I do with each one of them is I follow them I don't have them immediately in Ravensbrück. I start out with their background, where they came from, what they did, how they got into the resistance, what they did in the resistance, and then these 4 women who didn't know each other until they got to Ravensbrück, about these 4 women coming together at the camp, and how they and their compatriots, the other French women, basically decided they weren't going to be victims. They decided, thanks to Germaine Tillion, who was really, as I said, the leading figure. She was really kind of the mother of the group.
Just to clarify, in response to a note. This is all historical. You didn't make any of these
Oh,
women.
no, this is
This
all
is this is
historical.
history. These are
Oh,
real
this is
people.
history. This
Yeah.
is not a novel.
Every bit of this happened. Yeah.
Every bit of it
Okay.
happened.
Sorry. Just go on. I just wanted to make sure
Yeah,
that
one
was
of the things
clear.
that drives me
Yeah.
crazy is when people say to me, or write an email, "I loved your novel," and no,
Right. And
no,
it reads almost like a novel because you've done so
no,
much work. But no, I
no.
just want to say
Everything that
yeah.
happened did happen. Every quote that's in that book was said. So yes, these people all did and said what I said. I write that they did. So anyway, these four women really were kind of the leaders of this group of French women who basically set out to not be victims, as I said, who decided that if they were going to survive, and if they were going to survive, they had to band together. They had to form a sisterhood and take care of each other, because alone, they would die. There's no question about that. And then, as that went on, then they actually did, defy the Germans. They did resist the Germans in the camp.
Well, you write about how the anthropologist in particular, Germaine Tillion, she starts by because it comes naturally, she tries to make a study of everything that's going on and how the camp works. And as each of the new shipments of women come, she finds her way out and she shouts up to them, telling them the basic things they need to know so that they can survive the first, couple of weeks. Because otherwise, they'll never, here's what here's who's in charge. Here's what you need to do this. Here's what you can do. And she says over and over in your book that, it's only with knowledge that
Right,
you can navigate these horrendous conditions.
I love Germaine Tillion is just such a fascinating woman. She had been writing her doctoral dissertation when she was caught. I mean, she was in the resistance, but she was also working on a doctoral dissertation about what she had been doing in Algeria, and she was caught. And so she had a mound of information and brought it and had been working on it and brought it to Ravensbruck, having no idea of what a horrific place it was, thinking she would have time to work on her dissertation while she was at this camp. And they, of course, immediately took everything away. She never saw any of her material again. So that's exactly, she set out basically to do an anthropological study of Ravensbrück. And she not only did it herself in terms of studying, she enlisted a whole group of women inmates who were working for example, in the offices, who were Czechs and Poles, and she befriended them, and they would send her things. They would give her reports that they were working on, and so she really developed a really good sense of what it was like, how it was run. And what the fascinating thing, and because she writes a lot about this, is that doing that, it gave her the detachment. Studying how it ran gave her, she could step back, because that was her training. She was detached. She was looking at it as an observer. So it gave her a sense of detachment that most of the others didn't have, because when they came in and saw how horrifically the women were treated, how much like zombies they had become, it was just so overwhelming for newcomers. And to have someone like Germaine Tillion, as you said, meet every new group of French women coming in and lecturing them on how to react, and how, if they wanted to survive, that they probably weren't going to. I mean, the chances are very minimal, but if they were going to, they had to do this and this and this. And that was the life source for them. I mean, Geneviève de Gaulle said that it made the whole difference. I mean, that everybody was feeling terrified and helpless, and that they finally had some sort of sense of that there might be hope.
And that in itself was against the rules, right? What she was doing.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, to sneak out and to talk to these women,
right.
Unheard of, right?
Right. I mean, they were all sent to different barracks, and it was against the rules, and could be punished by death. to leave and to go to another, sneak off and go to another barracks. But Germaine Tillion, I don't know if she certainly acted as if she were fearless. I doubt that she was totally fearless, but she acted as if she were totally fearless. And she was such a source of inspiration for these younger women. Again, I had to keep reminding myself, these were teenagers, or in their early 20s. These were girls who had been in convent trained, that they had been in the resistance, so they were very independent and thought for themselves. But this is so out of their, they couldn't imagine being in this horrific situation. And Germaine helped them get through it, as you said, at least for the first however long it took to get acclimated to it. And they never really got acclimated to it, but she was just invaluable.
So let me take a step back here. I want to draw a wider picture and shift the angle a little bit. I mean, this audience, I think it's safe to say most of the people on this call are very familiar with concentration camp narratives.
Right.
But there are some differences in this story. And I just want you to fill in the details on this, but just to start, like Ravensbrück wasn't an extermination camp. It's a punishment camp. And as such, it was only tangentially concerned with Jews, right? So none of these women were Jewish. Very few of the women who were in the camp were Jewish. There were other reasons they were endangered or targeted, but typically not that. So one of the things that's interesting about this read is there's emphasis on resistance as opposed to just survival. In fact, even sometimes to the detriment of survival. I'm thinking of those women who refused to work in the bomb factory, or then some of them were killed. So first of all, draw us a picture. Like, how big was this place, and who was in it for the most part, and how many of them died, and how many were merely being subject to slave labor and mistreatment?
Right. Altogether, actually, nobody really knows how many were in there. I mean, the figure is thrown around 130,000, for the entire time. But Ravensbrück was so overcrowded at the end. Women were coming in and they were never registered. So we have absolutely no idea. I'm sure it was probably more than 130,000.
These are people who were being emptied out of the other camps as the Allies advanced.
Exactly.
Right?
As the Allies approached and the Germans were shutting down these camps and sending the women to Ravensbrück. And so we can talk about this later, but a lot of Jewish women did end up at Ravensbrück at the end of the war because they were sent from Auschwitz. But so it was huge. I mean, and it was vastly overcrowded, really almost right from the beginning. I think when it was built, it was meant to have about 15,000 people. It ended up at the end with 60,000 women in this camp. Just totally overwhelmed the whole administrative process. And it was not an extermination camp as such. It was a forced labor camp. It was a punishment camp, but a forced labor camp. But I always tell people when they say, "Oh, that's not too bad," and I say, "Well, it wasn't a quick extermination camp. It was a slow extermination camp because these women were sent as slave labor to a lot of various enterprises, including most of them into war factories. But they weren't treated well. I mean, they got almost no food. Ravensbrück was a petri dish of disease. They were beaten. They suffered really awful punishments for being too slow or for looking cross-eyed at a guard or whatever. I mean, they could be killed at any moment. So they were basically worked to death. And once a woman, and it's hard to say exactly how long. It depends on the age of the woman, whatever. But usually it was just a few months. Sometimes it would extend to a year or more. But until they were so weak they couldn't keep on. And once that happened, then they were killed. And then a whole new crop of women. Women were constantly coming in. A whole new crop of women were sent to the factories or whatever. So it was. It wasn't immediate death, but all of them knew that basically that the Germans destined then to die. I mean, Germans did not expect to have any survivors at the end of the war.
These weren't people who like would finish their term and go and leave and be released.
Right. No. I don't know that any of once they got there, any of them had the idea that they were probably going to survive. But thanks to Germaine Tillion and others, some of them had the hope, and they did have this. Again, I'm writing about the French, but women in the resistance were different than women who were not in the resistance. I mean, I found that so many of them, they were independent. They were very independent, strong-willed, didn't want people to tell them what to do. And a lot of them, of the four that I write about, they had very strong mothers. Geneviève de Gaulle was the only one who didn't have a mother because her mother died when she was very young. But the others had mothers who really encouraged them to do whatever they wanted to do. And they had mothers who actually were in the resistance themselves. So they were very much influenced, I think, by their mothers. But women in the resistance were very, very different. I mean, I'm sure that's true of men too. I mean, it takes a certain kind of person to risk your life
In the
every
first place.
day.
Yeah.
But for women particularly, I think it was so difficult. The women in France, because France was and still is to some extent a very patriarchal society, very conservative. Back then, I didn't know this when I started doing research for the book. Women didn't even have the right to vote yet in France. They didn't get it till 1944.
You said that you told me before that was partly because it was so obvious of what that the,
Yeah,
of which
I mean,
they counted the resistance.
right,
They
exactly.
were granted the vote.
Right. De Gaulle's provisional government, the legislature passed it because of women in the resistance, of what women in the resistance had done. So, these women were expected to be wives and mothers. And then basically, they said no. I mean, that's not the way we view our lives. And they came from all over. Again, I'm talking about France. They were from every kind of background. They came from all over the country. They were shopkeepers, they were clerical workers, they were countesses. One of the four women that I write about was a countess. So it didn't matter what their background is. They did share this kind of this common hatred of the Germans and this desire to get them out of their country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and once they were in the camps, you talk about in Ravensbruck, there's even this kind of crazy sequence where, is it Germaine or one of the other ones who writes a musical comedy, an operetta,
Right.
in secret on little tiny bits of paper,
Yeah.
about what it's like living there.
Right. It was Germaine. It was in the fall of 1944. So we had just had D-Day. The women there knew that D-Day had occurred. But things were really, really bad. Really bad. Women were dying. A lot of women were dying, and there was a lot of despair that that probably France would be liberated, but they would never be freed. They would die there. And so Germaine set out to lighten their spirits. And she was part of a work detail and of women like her. There were French women who were also very, independent and strong-willed and defied the Germans. And so instead of working on this detail, these other women kind of hid her away. And she set out to write over a 10-day period a musical operetta, an operetta filled with songs and dances. Songs that the other women knew, but she would put new lyrics to them. And so she just created this incredible story. And she would, of course, it couldn't be performed. That would be instant death. But she would, when they got back to the barracks, she would sing to them the songs, teach them the songs. And I don't know if she taught them the dances, but anyway, and so they were part of it. I mean, dozens of French women were part of it. And so, they would help her write. And when they would go to the work detail every morning, they would sing these songs and accompanied by German guards who had slightest idea what they're saying, because it was all in French, but they were basically making fun of the guards in these songs. And so she completed that, over the course of 10 days. And it was, it is like, whoa. But
all the things to do with your time while you're struggling to survive.
but it worked. It worked.
Yeah.
They wrote it down. They made several copies of it and circulated among the French women, thousands of French women who were at Ravensbruck. So for a brief moment, it did lift their spirits. It was not performed then. It took many decades, but it finally was performed before she died.
It's called something, what's verfügbar in hell, right? What is the,
yes,
what's the word mean?
Verfügbar was a reference to a prisoner who did everything they could, who was the lowest of the low, who got the worst jobs in the camp, had physical labor and, cleaning the toilets and things like that. But it was verfügbar were also the kinds of jobs that these women wanted, because it meant that they didn't have to do anything to further the German war effort. They refused to work in factories, many of them, and so they were willing to be verfügbar, the lowest of the low, and oftentimes they would do everything they could to escape. I mean, they would hide, they would do all that, but it was about the lowest of the low, but the lowest of the low in this musical comedy were wonderful. They were funny. They were the ones who sang the songs. It basically was a getting back at the Germans, and it was funny. The songs were great. And there were some very kind of poignant songs about France and what people missed. They missed food a lot. I mean, they were constantly talking about food. So she has a song in there about all, two women were going on a mental journey through France and going to each region and singing about what that particular region was famous for. So I think it really did help the women, and it was really quite a remarkable achievement.
And then it was performed after the war, and you talk about how it was actually kind of controversial because people thought, wait, how are we going to show this pushing back without somehow making light of what they experienced?
Well, she was determined. Germaine did not want this musical to ever appear, because they were afraid of that. I mean, all those survivors, the women who survived. Because remember, in the 1960s, 1970s, there was a lot of, as we know, of people who actually said that the Holocaust never happened,
minimization,
and so they didn't want to be, criticized for, being part of that, or so anyway, she hid it away, and it wasn't until the 2000s that it was rediscovered, and it was actually performed in Paris at a major theater.
Have you seen a production of this play?
I've seen it on film. You can see
there is a film.
There is a video, and it is really quite remarkable. It was performed, as I say in the book, in 2014, I think, at the University of Southern Maine. Maine, and apparently it was a huge hit, a huge success. I would suggest, if any of you are interested, to try to find it, because it's really, really good.
If we can find the link, maybe we'll put it in.
Yeah,
either we'll put it in the chat, or we'll send it out when we send out the recording of this. So actually, I want to just turn this around on you a little bit. Let me. Did you worry at all when you were writing about all this gallant resistance? Were you at all concerned that people would read it and say, oh, that doesn't sound so bad? I mean, that must have been kind of an interesting balance to strike when you're writing.
No, I never felt that because I made a real effort. Much of this book is horrific. I mean, the first half of it, or at least almost half
Absolutely.
of it.
No, a lot of it, almost
I
all,
go
yeah.
in, I go into great detail about what these women suffered. And I did that on purpose. I mean, I knew that the message I wanted to give was one of hope, courage, but I wanted people to see how incredibly awful it was. Despite being a forced labor camp, it was I can't nobody can describe how incredibly awful it was.
Yeah,
And so that was tough. I mean, it was tough living for months with, the evils that these women had to suffer during their time. And all of these women, I mean, Germaine was there probably about a year and a half, and that was the longest. I mean, so, but a year and a half
yeah.
there is like, a lifetime somewhere else. I mean, surviving Ravensbruck was something that none of those women got over. And
Right. Well,
what's
yeah.
extraordinary. That's one of the things I thought when I first started out, well, it's going to have a happy ending because they're going to survive and they're going to go back and they're going to get married and have families, which is true. They all did. But they never, never fully recovered from what they had been through. I mean, the miracle is that they were able to surmount that and have a good life, but not only have a good life for themselves, but create good lives for other people too. And that's really the triumph of these women.
Yeah.
But it was tough. It was tough writing that book.
Yeah. Well, if you'll forgive me, let's take it a little darker.
Mhm.
There's a long part of your book, aside from the stories of these individual women, there's a long section in the book about the Kanincians, what you call the rabbits, who are young Polish women who were
Mhm.
subjected to horrific, unspeakable scientific, quote,
Mhm.
scientific experiments.
Mhm.
And you follow those and who survived this camp again in a way through female solidarity. Do you want to
Right.
quickly tell some of that
Sure.
story?
Sure. I was really happy to write about the Poles because my husband and I wrote a book together called Question of Honor, which was about Poland during World War II. And the Poles had the best organized resistance movement in all of occupied Europe by far. And women were really an important part of it. And at Ravensbrück, the Poles made up by far the largest percentage of inmates there. And again, almost all of them were from resistance movements. So these young Polish women, most of them in their teens, early 20s, were selected by German doctors, Nazi doctors, for as guinea pigs for so-called scientific experiments on their legs, testing sulfa drugs. And they basically about 80 altogether were operated on. Their legs were basically butchered. They were slit open, and these doctors inserted bacilli, tetanus, and various kinds of infections into their legs, along with dirt and glass, shattered glass, to create infections, really awful infections, and to see, what the reaction would be. So this happened to, 70 to 80 of these young women. And it went on and on. And many of these women were operated more than once. And it was horrendous. I mean, it was just absolutely horrendous. A number of them, 5 or 6, died immediately. But the others, most of them finally were able to leave the hospital, but some of them could never walk again, and some of them were on crutches the rest of it. It was just incredibly, incredibly awful what happened to them. But they fought back. There wasn't obviously much they could do to actually fight back, but they actually at one point staged a protest march to the camp headquarters. And unbelievably, the officials didn't do anything to them. What happened to them really kind of, as the war went on, really kind of united the entire camp. So that at the end of the war, we're talking early 1945, everybody knew that the Nazis were probably going to kill these young women, these young Poles, so that there would be no evidence of what they had done. And the Poles themselves were sure that they were going to be executed, that they were never going to leave alive. And so in early 1945, word spread through the camp that in fact that was going to happen. This was in February 1945, and I devote really a whole chapter in the book to this. They actually, the word got out that it was going to happen on this particular day, and the whole camp came together and formed a plan to prevent that, and to help these young women escape. They were able to do that because it was so overcrowded by that point. Nobody really had any idea where people were, so it was easy to move around. And on that particular day, that in fact it was going to happen. And at the morning roll call, it was going to happen, and the Polish women were going to be taken from their barracks, and the camp. I go into great detail. The camp mounted a mutiny, and they had it all planned out, and it worked. I won't go into detail because it would take too long. It worked. They actually were able to help all these young women escape from their barracks, and hid them. They were hidden away in prepared hiding places. And because the camp was so chaotic, the Germans never found them.
Huh. And other people took their numbers at
Other
roll
people
call,
took their,
right?
in the roll call, other people, brought food to them. And of course, if the camp had been, had been in the beginning of the war, that could never have happened. But because it was such a total disastrous mess at that point, they were able to get away with it. And so they all survived. They all survived the 2 or 3 months between the time this happened and the time of the liberation of the camp, which is extraordinary. I mean, I don't know that I have ever heard of another camp where it was a camp-wide rebellion that actually was successful.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And again, it's and later after the war, it even extended to these women being taken on a kind of a publicity tour seeking reparations from the German government, right? I mean, there was all kinds of continued support for them.
Absolutely. It was this is my French crew here, the women I write about. The French were very close to the Poles. They were in the same barracks. I mean, a number of them were in the same barracks with the Polish rabbits, as they were called, the guinea pigs. And they became very close. They became very close friends. And after the war, the Frenchwomen survivors started a campaign, basically to get reparation and recognition for these Polish women who had been treated so horrendously. The West German government had taken on the responsibility of Nazi war crimes. I mean, they obviously were involved, but they took on the responsibility of reparations, etc. But they refused to pay reparations to the Polish women, and so
because they were in the Soviet zone.
They were in the Soviet zone. Yes, exactly. And the French women mounted a big campaign along with a number of Americans, and it took more than 10 years, but they finally won against the West German government, which was determined not to pay anything. But in the end, because of this incredible propaganda blitz, this publicity blitz put on by the French and mostly by their American partners, the West German government finally said, enough, we will pay. And that was in the early 1960s.
Sounds like once the Saturday Evening Post got involved, there was no hope for
Yeah,
the
it
other
was, yeah, it was
side, you
the
know.
Saturday
Yeah,
Review. Yeah, the
Saturday
Saturday
Review.
Review.
Yeah, Norman
Yeah,
Cousins. That's
that
a really good
magazine.
story.
It was, which is a very, very popular literary magazine in the mid 20th century. Yeah, the editor became one of the, the staunchest champions of these Polish women, and he was, he played a big role in that.
So actually, this leads to another question. One of the things I like about the way you wrote the book was that you then it continues on not completely into the present, but into how the story finally got told. You know, you talk about you write a lot about the filmmaker Maya Wexler, who I believe who's on this call, maybe.
Yes, I think so. She emailed me today and said that she
Um,
registered. So yeah,
um,
a big shout out to Maya, because Maya in the 1980s met one of these women, Jacqueline Dallencourt, as she was an American journalist actually covering the trial of Klaus Barbie, the Nazi butcher of Lyon, and as part of that, she met Jacqueline, and they became very close friends. And Maya just was just enamored, fascinated by the story that Jacqueline told of Ravensbruck and her and her friends there. And she set out to become a filmmaker and make a documentary about these women, which she eventually did. It took her, I think the documentary came out in 2000, but she basically became a documentary filmmaker to tell that story. The documentary is absolutely fantastic that she made. But what she also did during the time when she was making it, she did about 29, 30 hours of interviews with these women, maybe even more, over a course of several years, separately and together. And it was, it, it was, I won't say the most important piece of research, but it certainly was up there. So I was able to read those transcripts, and it just provided she brought them to life. I mean, those transcripts really brought these women to life. They talked about their childhood. They talked about their resistance activities. They talked about Ravensbrück. They talked about their friendship with each other, how important it was. And so it made them human. And it was an incredibly important piece of research for me. So I would encourage everybody to, you can go, find her documentary. You can rent it for, like $3.99 on Vimeo. And it is fantastic. It really, really is. You'll get a chance to see these women and see what, why for yourself, why they're so extraordinary.
I thought one of the aspects, I mean, the fact that you described this whole sequence was sort of, again, it's an example of how hard women seem to have to work to keep their stories from being forgotten. This is sort of a series of accidents that kept these women's experiences from disappearing in the general.
That's right. Yeah. But it's also a story of how the determination of women to tell those stories. I mean, Maya dedicated her life, for more than a decade
What's it
to
called, by the way, the movie?
Sisters in Resistance, I believe.
Sisters in Resistance. Okay.
I'm right, Maya. I hope that's right. Sisters in Resistance.
We're looking for the link.
Yeah. Anyway, it really changed her life. She talked about it, and she talks about it now, of how, what it taught her. And, to me, that the most important lesson is that no matter how awful things are, that ordinary citizens, if they join together in a community, can actually change the world. They actually can, or they certainly can make a difference. And for Maya, that was true. I mean, that was the lesson she drew from it, and I think it's a lesson that everyone can draw from it. I mean, again, by themselves, those women would have been helpless. They would have died. Together, they were not only able to survive, but to do great things.
Yeah, well, that's a great note. We're coming close to the end of this. I want to see if there are any questions. I think a lot of the questions that I saw pop up in the queue, you've answered, as you went, just organically. But if there are any questions, I'll ask Suzanne to come back. Otherwise, I have a few more of my own. Suzanne,
Okay.
anything?
Sure, yes, thank you very much. A lot of people want to know what was any connection that these women might have had with the Jewish prisoners that came. Were the Jewish prisoners that were coming over at the end of the war, were they treated differently? Were they part of the resistance movement at all? Is there any information about that available?
Well, first of all, there were a number of Jewish prisoners there who the Germans didn't know were Jewish. Quite a few. I mean, not a huge number, but quite a few. And there was one woman, Denise Vernet, who was there under a assumed name. And remember, a lot of these women, they weren't using their real names. They had code names. So, the Germans often didn't really know who these women really were. They didn't have their
Picked them up in the resistance and they just
right.
swept them.
They didn't have their actual name. And Denise Vernet was one of them. And she worked with she was one of the French women I'm talking about. She was one of the French women who took the place of the Poles in the roll call. And she confided to the women who are the main figures that she was Jewish. And of course, nobody, but there were a fair number, but they were there because they were in the resistance. They were not there because they were Jewish. At the end of the war, so there was no sense of they're Jewish and we're not. I mean, I think everybody who was there were in it together. Toward the end of the war, when the women came in from Auschwitz, the Jewish women came in from Auschwitz, the place was such a total chaotic mess that it was really, I don't think that there was much interaction going on that, I don't know. The answer is really, I don't know. So, but they came in at a time when pretty much everything had broken down in the camp. I mean, there was hardly any food, there was hardly any water.
And by then, just to sort of fill out the picture, as I recall from the book, by then there was also a gas chamber, right? That there were
was a gas
people
chamber.
being transported to the gas
People
chamber.
were being sent to the gas chamber, but they weren't sent there because they were Jews. They were sent there. Everybody was the Germans had hoped to get rid of everybody at Ravensbruck, but that was impossible because there's so many. But they were doing their best at the end to do that. But the great thing is that of these, I'm not exactly sure how many Jewish women, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 came in from Auschwitz. But toward the end of the war, at the end of the war, there was an actual rescue mission on the part of the Swedish Red Cross. They said at the very last minute, Heinrich Himmler, the SS head, who was basically trying to have a separate peace with the Allies, told the Swedes that they could come in and rescue women, and including Jewish women. And so at the very end, I think 8,000 women were liberated from Ravensbrück even before the camp was officially liberated. And of those 8,000, at least half or more were Jews. Many Jewish women survived Ravensbrück.
A
Can you
weird, improbable trajectory.
again, what was the date that it was liberated?
It was liberated in 1945 in end of May. I mean, which was not end of May. I mean, the war ended in 1945. It was just a few days before the actual official end of the war. But meanwhile, many of the all male camps had been liberated, like in February, March. Ravensbrück was because of its geographical location. That's one of the reasons why it was so late in getting liberated.
It's kind of in the middle of the forests and swamps,
Yes,
right? In northern Germany. It's
right.
yeah.
It was very close to Berlin, fairly close to Berlin. So, by then, the troops, Soviet and British and American troops, were focused on taking Berlin. And the last thing they were going to do was liberate these women from in Ravensbrück.
And is this a camp that people are able to visit today? Like people go to other camps and
Yes, you
visit and
can,
memorialize?
but there is, unlike Auschwitz and Buchenwald and the others, there's very little there. I mean, again, it was a Soviet. It was in the Soviet zone. The Soviets made it a military base, and so they tore down most of the barracks, most of the buildings within the camp. And it's interesting that what's mostly there are housing for the German guards, etc., outside the camp. Some of those buildings are still there, and but it's not as complete as the other concentration camps. There's really not not a great deal there.
Mm.
But you can, yes, you can go and see it.
I've actually, yeah, I came across it on a driving trip in the early 90s in Germany when the East German presentation of the horrors was still pretty much the only thing that was there. And it's very different from what we see in other camps.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So did you have more, Suzanne?
I just was going to wrap up because we're
Okay.
we're at the end. I just wanted to remind everybody that Lynne's book is called The Sisterhood of Ravensbrück, and I put a link to that as well as her website where you can see her other books in the chat, and we will send out a link as a follow-up for everybody. Also, Maya Wexler, and it's Wechsler, is the filmmaker that Lynne talked about, and her documentary is called Sisters in Resistance, and we'll send that out with a link as well. Lynne, Amy, thank you so much for today. I want to thank our audience for joining us, and I encourage everybody to go to momentmag.com where you can sign up for our upcoming programs. Thank you very much.